The wind had teeth in this part of the New Mexico territory, and as November bled toward winter, it gnawed right to the bone. Eli Morgan felt it through his worn wool coat as he crested the last rise, his gaze falling upon the skeletal remains of what had once been a dream. The ranch sat huddled in a shallow valley, a collection of dark shapes against the dying light. From this distance, he could almost pretend the blackened timbers of the north barn were just long, deep shadows. Almost. His horse, a sturdy buckskin named Flint, plodded onward without command, knowing the path to meager oats and a dry stall. The land itself seemed to hold its breath. The grama grass was bleached to the color of bone, and the cottonwoods along the creek bed were naked, their skeletal branches clawing at a sky the color of slate. It was a silent, lonely landscape, and it had shaped Eli in its image. He had been riding the fence line for 3 days, a task that once took 2 men half that time. His brother, Samuel, had always been the faster one with a post-hole digger, his laughter echoing off the canyon walls as he worked. Now, the only sound was the tireless wind, whispering through the sparse pinon and juniper like a mourner who could not stop weeping. The silence was a weight, pressing down on Eli until he felt as hollowed out as the land around him. The feud with the Grahams had ended a year ago, but it had not truly ended at all. It had simply taken Samuel and gone quiet, festering like a wound that would not close. It had left Eli with half a barn, a dozen fewer head of cattle, and an emptiness so vast it felt like a third person living in the small cabin with him. Dismounting in the yard, his movements were stiff, economical. There was no wasted motion in his life anymore. Every action was reduced to its essential purpose. He unsaddled Flint, his hands working the leather straps with a familiarity that required no thought. He brushed the horse down, his touch firm but detached, murmuring a few low words that were more habit than affection. He forked hay into the manger, filled the water trough from the hand pump, the rhythmic squeak and groan of the handle the only reply to the wind. Inside the cabin, the cold was waiting for him. The fire in the stone hearth was long dead, its ashes a pale gray ghost of warmth. He did not bother to light it. He moved to the dry sink, poured water from a bucket into a tin basin, and scrubbed the trail dust from his face and hands. The water was shockingly cold, a small, sharp pain that made him feel momentarily alive. He looked at his reflection in the small, cracked piece of mirror nailed to the wall. The face that stared back was a stranger's, all hard lines and shadows, the blue eyes so pale they seemed frozen over. He was 28, but he looked 40. Grief was a harsh sun. It weathered a man from the inside out. His supper was as methodical as his chores. He sliced a piece of salt pork and fried it in a skillet. It sizzled loud in the stillness. He ate it with the last of a stale loaf of bread, standing over the stove, not bothering to sit at the small wooden table Samuel had built. After, he poured a measure of whiskey into a tin cup and sat in the single chair facing the cold hearth. The liquor burned a slow, welcome trail down his throat. It did not make the emptiness go away, but it blurred the edges, taking the sharpness from his memories. He drank until the bottom of the cup was dry. Then he rose, banked the stove for the night, and fell into his bunk without undressing, seeking an oblivion that sleep rarely offered. This was his life: mending, feeding, drinking, forgetting. A routine of bare survival in the ruins of a shared dream. 2 days later, the weekly stagecoach from Santa Fe kicked up a cloud of dust as it rattled into the small, wind-whipped town of Redemption. The name was a bitter joke to most who lived there. It was a hard-scrabble place of false-fronted buildings and squinting eyes, a town that offered little more than a place to water your horse and your regrets. When the coach door opened, a woman descended, moving with a careful slowness that spoke of an injury not quite healed. She was dressed in a simple, dark traveling dress, and a heavy veil obscured her face, a strange sight in such a practical, unadorned town. In one hand, she clutched a small, worn carpet bag. It seemed to be her only possession in the world, Her name was Clara Duval, and she felt the town's judgment before she even took a full breath of its dusty air. It came in the form of suddenly silenced conversations on the boardwalk, in the way women pulled their children a little closer, in the sharp, assessing glances from the men loafing outside the saloon. They knew. News traveled faster than any stagecoach, carried on whispers and embellished by speculation. The scandal had followed her all the way from Philadelphia, a woman of good family, they had heard, who had thrown it all away for an affair with a married man, a woman who had borne a child out of wedlock, a child she refused to speak of. She walked with her head held high, though every stare felt like a physical blow. Her leg ached, a deep, throbbing pain from the long, jostling ride. She needed a room, a place to rest, to simply be behind a closed door. The sign for the Redemption Hotel and boarding house swung on creaking hinges. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of stale beer and fried onions. A balding man with a suspicious squint stood behind the front desk. "I need a room," Clara said, her voice clearer and stronger than she felt. The man looked her over, his gaze lingering on her veiled face. "We are full up," he said flatly, turning his attention to a ledger that seemed to require his full concentration. Clara knew it was a lie. The town was half empty. "Just for a night or two," she insisted gently. "I said we are full," he repeated, not looking up. The dismissal was as solid and unmovable as a locked door. It was the same at the other boarding house, a smaller, tidier place run by a severe-looking woman with her hair in a tight bun. "No vacancies," the woman said, her lips a thin, disapproving line, her eyes flicking to Clara's belly as if she could see the sin imprinted there. Desperation began to prick at the edges of Clara's composure. The sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange. The wind was picking up, carrying the promise of a truly cold night. She had very little money and nowhere to go. The world, it seemed, had run out of rooms for her. As she stood on the boardwalk, uncertain of her next move, a woman came out of the general store, her arms laden with a sack of flour. She was older, her face a roadmap of hard years, but her eyes held a flicker of something that was not outright condemnation. She stopped a few feet from Clara. "You are the one they are talking about," the woman said. It was not a question. Clara simply nodded, her throat too tight to form words. The woman sighed, a weary sound. "Folks in this town think judgment is a virtue. My name is Martha Gable. My husband passed 2 years ago." She shifted the flour sack. "I have no room in the house. It is not proper, but the barn is warm enough. There is clean hay in the loft. You can stay there for a day or two, until you figure your way." Tears pricked Clara's eyes, hot and sudden. She had been met with such uniform cruelty that this small, grudging offer of charity felt like a miracle. "Thank you," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "God bless you, Mrs. Gable." Martha Gable just grunted. "God has little to do with it. It is just a barn, but do not expect me to fight your battles for you. I am too old for that." The barn was small but clean, smelling sweetly of hay and old wood. A thick horse blanket provided some warmth against the chill that seeped through the walls. For the first time in weeks, Clara felt a sliver of safety. She ate the bread and cheese Mrs. Gable had given her and fell into an exhausted sleep in the loft, the sound of the wind a lonely lullaby. The next day, she went into town for supplies with the last of her coins, while waiting for the storekeeper to weigh out a bag of beans. She overheard 2 ranchers talking by the stove. "Heard Eli Morgan was up on the North Range," one said, a lanky man with a sun-scorched face. "Still trying to run that whole place by himself, too proud to hire help." "More like too broken," the other man, older and heavier, replied. "Has not been right since Samuel was killed. That place is falling down around his ears. The Grahams will just wait him out, pick up the pieces for pennies on the dollar when he finally gives in." "It is a shame," the first man said, shaking his head. The Morgan boys built a good spread, but one man cannot fight the land, the Grahams, and his own ghosts all at once. He needs a hand, whether he will admit it or not." Clara listened, her heart thumping a slow, deliberate rhythm. A man who kept to himself, a man who refused help, a man drowning in a grief so deep the whole town could see it. She knew something of that kind of isolation. An idea, desperate and foolish, began to take root in her mind. It was a long shot, a gamble born of having no other cards to play. But what did she have to lose? She had already lost everything that mattered. The next morning, she thanked Mrs. Gable, who accepted her thanks with a slight, non-committal nod. Following the directions the storekeeper had given her, Clara started walking. The Morgan ranch was miles out of town, a lonely outpost against the rugged hills. The road was little more than a set of ruts in the dry earth, and the sun, though weak, was relentless. Her leg began to ache, a familiar fire that spread from her ankle to her knee. She limped, but she did not stop. She focused on the horizon, on the distant line of mesas that seemed to shimmer in the thin air. She had nowhere else to go. By the time she saw the ranch, the sun was low in the sky, and every step was an agony. She saw the half-burned barn, the neglected look of the place. It looked as broken as she felt. A man was in the yard, splitting wood with a grim, focused intensity. He swung the axe with a powerful, rhythmic grace, each crack of the splitting logs echoing in the vast silence. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in faded denim and a worn flannel shirt. He did not see her until she was standing at the edge of his yard, clutching her small bag. Dust caked on her dress and face. Eli stopped, the axe held loosely in his hand. He watched her approach, his face an unreadable mask. His eyes narrowed with suspicion. Strangers did not come out here, especially not women, alone and on foot. "What do you want?" he asked. His voice was rough, like stones grinding together. Clara had to take a breath before she could speak. "I heard in town you might need some help," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I am a hard worker. I can cook, clean, mend clothes, help with the chickens, the garden. I do not need wages, just a place to sleep and food to eat." Eli stared at her for a long moment, his gaze so intense she felt it strip away her defenses. "I do not need any help," he said, his voice flat and final. He turned back to the woodpile, lifting the axe as if she were no longer there. "Please," she said, a note of desperation creeping into her voice. "I have nowhere else to go." He slammed the axe into the chopping block and turned back to her, his face dark with irritation. "That is not my problem. This is private property. You should go back to town." "They will not have me in town," she said softly. A flicker of something, understanding, maybe, or just weary recognition, passed through his eyes. He had heard the gossip. Then, it did not matter. "I work alone," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Now go." He turned his back on her again, a clear dismissal. Clara stood there, frozen. The long walk, the pain, the last, fragile tendril of hope. It all broke inside her at once. The world tilted, the edges of her vision going gray and fuzzy. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and her legs, already weak from exhaustion and pain, simply gave out. The last thing she saw before the darkness took her was the hard, unyielding dirt of the ranch yard rushing up to meet her. When she woke, she was lying on a narrow bunk, a coarse blanket pulled up to her chin. The room was dim, lit by a single kerosene lamp that cast long, dancing shadows on the rough-hewn wooden walls. For a moment, she was utterly disoriented. Then she remembered. The walk, the man, the collapse. He was sitting in a chair by the hearth, where a small fire now crackled, fighting a losing battle against the drafts that snaked through the cabin. He was not looking at her. He was staring into the flames, a tin cup of what she assumed was whiskey held in his hand. She tried to sit up, and a sharp pain shot through her ankle. She gasped, falling back against the thin mattress. His head turned. In the firelight, she could see the deep lines etched around his eyes and mouth. "Your ankle is swollen," he said, his voice still gruff, but lacking the hard edge it had held outside. "You must have twisted it." He rose and came over to the bunk. He carried a small basin of water and a strip of clean cloth. Without a word, he knelt and gently lifted her foot. His touch was surprisingly careful as he soaked the cloth in the cool water and began to wrap her ankle. He worked with a quiet, impersonal efficiency, his focus entirely on the task. The cabin was silent save for the pop and hiss of the fire and the sound of the wind, which had risen to a mournful howl outside the walls. It rattled the single window pane and moaned under the eaves. A vast and lonely sound. Clara watched the man's bent head, the way the firelight caught the dark strands of his hair. He was a complete stranger, a man who had told her to leave. And yet here he was, tending to her injury in the dead of night. She was exhausted, hurt, and more frightened than she had ever been in her life. But looking at the rigid set of his shoulders, the deep, unyielding sorrow in the lines of his face, she saw a loneliness that mirrored her own. They were two broken people, trapped in a silent room while a storm raged outside. As he finished tying the cloth, his fingers brushed against her skin. The simple, fleeting contact sent a strange warmth through her. He started to pull away, to retreat back into his shell of silence. But before he could, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper, almost lost in the sound of the wailing wind. "Let me help you." Eli Morgan froze. He did not look at her. He simply remained kneeling by the bunk, his head bowed, the warmth of the fire on his back and a stranger's plea hanging in the air between them. The wind howled its answer, but from the man, there was only a deep and profound silence. The first light of dawn was a pale, watery gray that did little to pierce the bone-deep chill of the cabin. Clara woke with a start, her body stiff from the unfamiliar bunk. For a moment, she was lost. The events of the previous day a jumbled nightmare of dust and exhaustion. Then it came back to her, the cold refusal, the humiliating collapse, the quiet intensity of the man tending her swollen ankle. He was gone. The chair by the hearth was empty, and the bunk across the room where he must have slept was neatly made, the blanket pulled taut. A profound silence filled the small space, broken only by the whisper of the wind under the door. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. Had he left her? Put her out while she slept? She sat up, testing her ankle. It was stiff and tender, but the swelling had gone down. He had wrapped it well. She swung her legs over the side of the bunk, her feet touching the cold, rough-hewn floorboards. She would not be a burden. She had made a promise, whispered into the howling dark, and she would keep it. Whether he wanted her to or not, her survival depended on her usefulness. Moving with a careful, limping gait, she found her purpose in the dim light. The room was tidy but stark, bearing the unmistakable imprint of a man living without the softening touch of a woman. A thin layer of dust coated the surfaces. She found a worn broom behind the door and began to sweep, her movements slow but methodical. The gentle rasp of the bristles on the wood was a satisfying, purposeful sound. She built up the fire in the hearth, coaxing the embers back to life until a cheerful blaze pushed back the gloom. She found a coffee pot and a sack of beans, ground them with a small hand-cranked mill, and soon the rich, bracing aroma filled the cabin. It was the first truly comforting smell she had encountered in months. Her exploration led her to a small chicken coop behind the cabin, where a half-dozen hens clucked and scratched in the dirt. She found a basket and collected 4 eggs, still warm to the touch. When she returned to the cabin, Eli was standing just inside the doorway, his silhouette dark against the growing light. He had come in as silently as a shadow. He held a pail of milk, its surface steaming slightly in the cold air. He stopped when he saw her, his eyes taking in the swept floor, the crackling fire, the pot of coffee bubbling on the hearth. His face was a stone wall of inscrutability. She expected anger, a sharp command to leave his things alone. She braced herself for the dismissal she was sure would come. "The coffee is ready," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. He did not reply. He walked past her to the dry sink and poured the milk into a clay pitcher. He moved with a heavy weariness, as if every limb was weighted down with an invisible load. He took 2 tin mugs from a shelf, poured coffee into each, and placed them on the small table. He sat, gesturing with his head toward the other chair. It was not an invitation so much as a command. Clara fried the eggs and some salt pork she found in the larder. They ate in a silence that was as thick and tangible as the rough wooden table between them. It was not a hostile quiet, not like the silences she had endured back east, which had been filled with accusation and unspoken resentments. This was something different. It was the silence of 2 people who had run out of words for the world, each locked in the solitary confinement of their own past. She would glance up and find him watching her, his pale blue eyes holding a guarded, assessing look. He was trying to figure her out, and she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that he was also waiting for her to break, to complain, to reveal herself as the useless, fallen woman the world believed her to be. She would not give him the satisfaction. Days bled into a week, and a strange, unspoken rhythm established itself between them. Clara would wake before him, start the fire and the coffee, and tend to the chickens. Eli would rise and do his work in the barn and with the cattle, his movements economical and precise. They moved around each other in the small cabin like 2 planets in a silent orbit, held together by a gravity of shared loneliness, but kept apart by a force of mutual caution. The work became Clara's salvation. There was an honest simplicity to it that she'd never known. She scrubbed the floors until the wood gleamed. She washed their meager clothes and hung them on a line, where they flapped like prayer flags in the constant wind. She discovered a small sack of flour and a tin of yeast and began to bake bread. The scent of it, warm and wholesome, filled the cabin and for a few hours made it feel less like a shelter and more like a home. For Eli, her presence was a constant, low-grade disturbance. He was a man accustomed to the stark landscape of his own grief, and she was an unexpected feature in it, a splash of color he did not know how to interpret. He would watch her from the corner of his eye as she worked, her movements becoming more confident as her ankle healed. He saw the way she pushed a stray strand of her dark hair from her face, the quiet focus in her eyes as she stitched a tear in his shirt. These small, domestic acts were a painful reminder of a life he had thought was lost to him forever. They reminded him of his mother, of the time before the feud, before Samuel. He was mending a stretch of fence on the western pasture, the percussive rhythm of his hammer against the staples, the only sound for miles. The repetitive motion, the familiar feel of the wire stretcher in his hands, had a way of unlocking doors in his mind he preferred to keep bolted. Suddenly, he was no longer on the wind-scoured plains of 1882. He was back in the dust and chaos of that night a year ago. The memory came with the phantom smell of gunpowder and blood. Samuel was lying on the ground, propped against a wagon wheel, his shirt a dark, spreading stain. The Grahams had ambushed them on the trail from town, a hail of bullets from the rocks above. Eli had fired back, dropping one of them before they fled into the darkness. But it was too late. He knelt beside his brother, pressing a piece of his own torn shirt against the wound, a useless gesture against such a fatal tide. Samuel's breath was a ragged, shallow thing. "Eli?" Samuel had whispered, his hand weakly gripping Eli's arm. His eyes were wide, already looking at something far beyond the dark hills. "I am here, Samuel, just hold on." Eli's voice was breaking. Samuel coughed, a wet, terrible sound. "No time." His grip tightened for a moment. Do not let the hate eat you. Eli, promise me." "They will pay for this," Eli had snarled, tears of rage and grief blurring his vision. "I swear to you, they will pay." No? The word was surprisingly firm. That is what they want. Another feud, more blood. It ends. With me. Promise me. Eli, live. Just live. Samuel's hand went slack. His eyes stared blankly at the indifferent stars. And Eli had been left alone with a promise he did not know how to keep. The silence of his brother's last breath, a roar that had never faded. He struck the fence post with the flat of his hammer. A single, sharp crack of sound that echoed his own splintering heart. The promise was a cage. It kept him from the vengeance that was his right, but it did not offer him peace. It just left him trapped, alone, with the ghosts. A week later, the sky turned a bruised, ugly color. The wind, usually a constant companion, fell eerily silent. Eli came in from the barn, his face grim. "A norther is coming," he said. The first unsolicited words he had spoken to her in days. "A bad one. We need to get the herd into the canyon." Clara saw the urgency in his eyes. There was no time for questions. She pulled on her worn coat and followed him out into the unnerving calm. The air was heavy, charged with an almost electric tension. They worked quickly. Eli on Flint, riding out to the small herd of cattle grazing in the valley, and Clara on foot, opening the series of gates that would lead them to a narrow, sheltered box canyon that offered some protection from the wind. The storm hit with the suddenness of an ambush. The temperature plummeted, and the wind slammed into them, a solid wall of force that stole their breath. It carried a blinding sleet that stung their faces like tiny needles. The cattle, already spooked, began to low and mill in confusion. Clara had never experienced anything like it. The raw, untamed power of the land was terrifying. She felt small and helpless against the screaming onslaught of the wind. A wave of panic rose in her throat, cold and choking. She wanted to run, to hide, to cower in the small cabin. But then she saw Eli. He rode into the heart of the storm, a solitary, determined figure against the raging sky. He was not fighting the storm. He was moving with it, his voice a low, commanding shout that cut through the gale, pushing the frightened animals forward. She saw the look on his face, a grim fatalism mixed with a fierce will to endure. And in that moment, she understood something about him, and about this land. It did not care about your sorrows or your scandals. It only cared if you had the strength to stand up to it. Her own fear seemed trivial in the face of his struggle. She gritted her teeth against the wind, her thin coat offering little protection, and pushed the last of the stragglers through the gate, her hands raw and numb from the cold. They fought the storm together for what felt like an eternity, their bodies brushing against each other in the urgent, chaotic work. When the last of the cattle were safe in the canyon, they stumbled back to the cabin, soaked to the skin and shaking with cold. Inside, the fire seemed like a miracle. They huddled before it, steam rising from their wet clothes. The storm raged outside, a wild beast throwing itself against the thin wooden walls of their shelter. The shared danger, the desperate teamwork, had broken down some of the barriers between them. The silence that fell now was different again. It was the quiet of exhaustion, of mutual survival. Eli finally broke it, his voice low and raspy. "Why did you come west?" Clara stared into the flames, watching the wood turn from black to glowing red. She could have told him a lie, a half-truth. But the storm had stripped away all pretense. It demanded honesty. "I had nowhere else to go," she said, the simple words holding the full weight of her ruined life. He nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the fire. He understood. He had nowhere else to go, either. The rumors started when Eli went into redemption the following week for supplies. He felt the shift in the air the moment he stepped into the general store. The usual gruff nods were replaced with cold stares. Conversations stopped when he approached. He saw two women whispering behind their hands, their eyes darting toward him with undisguised contempt. The storekeeper, a man he had known for years, served him with a clipped, business-like efficiency, avoiding his eyes. That fallen woman still out at your place? One of the Graham cousins asked loudly from the back of the store, ensuring everyone could hear. Heard you were keeping her warm. A man has his needs, I suppose. Eli's hands clenched into fists at his sides. The promise he made to Samuel screamed in his mind. He turned slowly, his pale eyes locking with the man's. He said nothing. He let the silence stretch. Let his cold, quiet fury fill the space. The Graham cousin, a man full of bluster but little real courage, looked away first, muttering something under his breath. Eli paid for his supplies and walked out, the whispers following him like flies. The town had passed its judgment. He was no longer just the grieving brother. He was the man who had taken in a sinner. He did not tell Clara what had happened, but she knew. She saw it in the hard set of his jaw, in the way he retreated even further into his silence. The world was shrinking again, leaving them isolated on their small patch of broken land. It was a few days later when they had their first visitor. A boy, no more than 12, appeared at the edge of the yard, leading a scrawny mule. He was thin, with a shock of unruly brown hair and wide, curious eyes. He stood there for a long time, as if gathering his courage, before he finally walked toward the barn where Eli was mending a harness. "Mr. Morgan?" the boy asked, his voice cracking slightly. Eli looked up, surprised. "What is it, boy?" "My name is Sam Miller. My father is the preacher." The boy shuffled his feet. I heard you might need a hand sometimes. I am good with horses. I could muck out the stalls. For free. Eli studied the boy. He knew Preacher Miller, a man who spoke of hellfire with relish and saw sin in every shadow. "Does your father know you are here?" Sam looked down at his scuffed boots. "No, sir. He says I should not come out this way." "Then you should listen to your father and go home," Eli said, turning back to his work. The boy did not move. "But you fought the Grahams," he said, a note of hero worship in his voice. "My PA says you are a man lost to anger, but I think you are brave." Clara had come out of the cabin, drawn by the sound of voices. She saw the boy's earnest, open face and the rigid wall of Eli's back. "Hello, Sam," she said gently, her voice warm. "It is a cold day to be out riding. Would you like a piece of fresh bread? I have some apple butter." The boy's eyes lit up. He looked from Clara's kind face to Eli's forbidding back and made his choice. He followed Clara to the cabin. Eli watched them go, a muscle twitching in his jaw. Sam became a regular, if secret, visitor. He would appear 2 or 3 times a week, a boy starved for adventure and drawn to the quiet strength he sensed in Eli. He would help with small chores, his youthful energy a stark contrast to the heavy atmosphere of the ranch. Clara took him under her wing, mending a tear in his shirt and always having something for him to eat. She spoke to him of books and places back east, and he listened, fascinated. One afternoon, Sam was helping Clara feed the chickens. He was telling her a long, rambling story about a stray dog he had found, and in his excitement, he tripped over a water bucket, sending a cascade of water splashing over his boots. He sat down hard in the dirt, looking stunned for a second before a wide grin split his face. He started to laugh, a pure, unrestrained peal of boyish delight. Clara, surprised, smiled back. Then she began to laugh with him, a soft, rusty sound at first, as if she had forgotten how, then growing stronger. Eli was standing by the corral, watching them. The sound of their laughter drifted across the yard, alien and yet achingly familiar. He saw the genuine joy on Clara's face, the way it transformed her, wiping away the shadows of sadness and fear. He saw the boy, innocent and alive. A strange feeling, tight and painful, constricted his chest. A smile, small and fleeting, touched his own lips before he could stop it. It felt like the cracking of frozen earth after a long winter. The change in him was subtle, almost imperceptible. He began to speak a little more, a quiet question about the firewood, a gruff observation about the weather, but the real shift was in his actions. A few mornings later, the air had a vicious, biting frost. Clara was about to head out to the henhouse, pulling on her thin, frayed gloves. Eli was by the fire, drinking his coffee. He saw her shiver as she opened the cabin door. He said nothing. He simply rose, took her gloves from her hands, and held them open before the crackling flames. He held them there for a long moment, letting the wool soak up the heat. Then, still without a word, he turned and pressed them back into her hands. The warmth was a shock, a small, profound comfort against the bitter cold. Clara looked up at him, her eyes wide with surprise. He met her gaze for just a second, a flicker of something unreadable in his pale eyes, before he turned back to the fire. It was not a grand gesture. It was a small thing, but in the vast, cold silence of their lives, it was everything. The deep cold of winter settled over the land, locking the earth in a grip of iron. The wind was a constant thief, stealing warmth from every crack in the cabin and piling snow in silent, sculpted drifts against the barn. The world shrank to the boundaries of the Morgan Ranch, a small island of stark survival in a sea of white. Inside this enforced isolation, the space between Eli and Clara began to change. The silences grew less cautious and more companionable, filled with the small sounds of their shared existence, the scrape of a fork on a plate, the soft hiss of Clara's mending needle, the rustle of a page as Eli read from a worn almanac by the fire. It was in the barn, a place that was Eli's domain but which Clara had slowly started to bring into a state of order, that she found the past. She was sweeping out a disused tack room, a space filled with forgotten things, brittle leather, rusted bits, and the faint, sad smell of decay. In the far corner, her broom caught on a floorboard that gave way with a slight groan. Curiosity, a feeling she had not indulged in a long time, got the better of her. She knelt, her fingers prying at the edge of the plank. It came up easily, revealing a small, dark hollow beneath. Nestled inside was a wooden box, bound in leather, its surface smooth with handling. Her heart beat a little faster. This was a secret place. This was something hidden. She hesitated, feeling like a trespasser in the most private chambers of Eli's grief. But the urge to understand the man who moved so silently beside her was too strong. She lifted the box out. It was not heavy. She opened the lid. The first thing she saw was a packet of letters, tied with a faded blue ribbon. They were written in a fine, elegant hand, the ink slightly faded. She carefully untied the ribbon and read the first few lines of the top letter. "My dearest Samuel," it began. "Your father and I pray for your safety every night. This wild territory you and Eli have chosen seems a world away from the green hills of Ohio." It was from his mother. The letters were full of news from home, of hope for the ranch, of a love that spanned 1,000 miles. Beneath the letters was a leather-bound sketchbook. Clara opened it to find a world teeming with life. There were detailed drawings of a hawk in flight, the delicate anatomy of a prairie wildflower, the placid face of a milk cow, and there were sketches of Eli. Eli laughing, his head thrown back, a wide, unguarded expression on his face she could not imagine. Eli asleep by a campfire, his features softened in repose. Eli on his horse, staring at the horizon, the lines of his face already hinting at the hardness to come. It was Samuel's view of his brother, a vision of the man before the world had broken him. At the very bottom of the box was a large, folded piece of parchment. It was an unfinished map. The existing lines of the Morgan Ranch were drawn in firm, confident ink, but branching out from them were fainter pencil lines, sketching out a future that had never come to be. They traced the path of a creek, marking out new grazing routes, a spot for a larger barn, a place for an apple orchard. It was a map of a dream, meticulously planned by two brothers, This box was not just a collection of things, it was the ghost of Samuel Morgan. She was so lost in the world the box contained that she did not hear Eli enter the barn. "What are you doing?" The voice was cold steel. Clara jumped, her heart leaping into her throat. He was standing in the doorway, his face a thundercloud of black fury. His eyes were not on her, but on the open box in her lap, on the intimate pieces of his past she had laid bare. I found it," she stammered, her hands moving to close the lid as if to hide the evidence of her intrusion. "I was cleaning, and the floorboard was loose." He strode across the room in 3 quick steps and snatched the box from her. The sketchbook and letters tumbled onto the dusty floor. He did not seem to notice. He was shaking, a tremor of pure, unrestrained rage running through his body. "These are not for you," he bit out, his voice choked and raw. "This is not your past. This is not your grief. You have no right." His anger was a physical force, so powerful it seemed to suck the air from the small room. It was not aimed at her. She could see that through her fear. It was aimed at the letters, at the drawings, at the ghost she had unwittingly released. He was a man drowning, and she had just reminded him of the air he used to breathe. He stared down at the box, his knuckles white, his breath coming in ragged bursts. Then, with a strangled cry of anguish, he hurled the box against the far wall. It struck with a sickening crack and fell to the floor, splintered and broken. He stood there, panting, his shoulders heaving, a wild, cornered animal trapped by his own memories. Clara was shaking, her own fear a cold knot in her stomach, the sensible part of her, the part that had learned to survive by making herself small and invisible, screamed at her to run, to flee the barn, the ranch, this man and his terrifying sorrow. But she did not move. She looked at him, and she did not see a monster. She saw a man in so much pain he had forgotten how to be anything else. Slowly, deliberately, she knelt and began to gather the scattered letters and the fallen sketchbook. Her hands trembled, but her movements were steady. She placed them carefully back on the floor, inside the broken remains of the box. Then she rose, and without a word, she walked out of the barn, leaving him alone with the wreckage. That night, the silence in the cabin was a heavy, suffocating blanket. Eli did not eat. He sat by the fire, staring into the flames, his back a rigid wall of misery. Clara ate her own meal quietly, her every movement feeling loud and intrusive in the thick stillness. She cleaned up, her heart aching with a sorrow that was not entirely her own. She knew what it was to have your most private wounds exposed. After, when the fire had burned down to glowing embers, she could not bear it any longer. She walked over to where he sat, her soft shod feet making no sound on the wooden floor. He did not look up as she stood beside his chair. "You do not have to carry all of it alone," she said, her voice a gentle whisper in the quiet room. He flinched, as if her words were a physical touch. He still did not look at her, but the rigid line of his shoulders softened almost imperceptibly. He said nothing, but he did not tell her to go away. He did not push her from his circle of grief. He simply sat there, and for the first time, he let her stand beside him in it. She rested her hand for a fleeting second on the back of his chair, a small, tentative gesture of comfort, before retreating to her own side of the room. No other words were spoken, but a profound shift had occurred. The deep, simmering tension between them had not vanished, but it had changed its nature, from a current of caution and mistrust to one of fragile, unspoken understanding. A few weeks later, a rider from a neighboring ranch stopped by on his way to town. He brought news. Martha Gable, the widow who had given Clara shelter in her barn, had been taken by a fever. She was old, and the doctor did not think she would last the winter. A sense of duty, sharp and clear, cut through Clara. That small act of kindness had been the only thing that had stood between her and utter despair. She had to go. "I need to go to her," she told Eli that evening. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. He knew what going to town meant for her. "The preacher's wife will be there," he said. It was a warning. "I do not care," Clara replied, her voice steady. "I owe Mrs. Gable a debt." He nodded slowly. The next morning, he hitched the small buckboard wagon for her. He did not offer to go with her, but the act of preparing the wagon was its own form of support. "Be careful," he said, his eyes meeting hers for a brief, intense moment. Redemption had not softened its judgment. As Clara walked down the main street toward the widow's small house, she felt the familiar weight of hostile stares. Whispers followed her like a cloud of biting insects. She kept her head high, her gaze fixed forward. Mrs. Gable was frail, her breath shallow, her skin the color of old parchment. Clara spent the day by her bedside, bathing her forehead with cool water, spooning broth between her dry lips, and speaking to her in low, soothing tones. Late in the afternoon, she realized the widow's supply of laudanum for the pain was gone. She would have to face the town's primary hub of gossip, the general store. She was standing at the counter, waiting for the storekeeper to measure out the medicine, when a voice cut through the room's low murmur. "Well, look what the wind blew in," sneered a woman standing near the fabric bolts. It was Mrs. Miller, the preacher's wife, flanked by two other self-righteous townswomen. "I am surprised you dare show your face here, after bringing your shame to that poor man out on the Morgan ranch." Clara turned slowly. "I am here to buy medicine for Mrs. Gable," she said, her voice even and calm. "A fine pretense for parading your sins in front of decent folk." "Mrs." Miller shot back, her voice rising. "We all know what kind of work a woman like you does for a lonely man." The store fell silent. Everyone was watching. Clara could feel the heat of their stares, the cruel pleasure they took in her public humiliation. Her past was a brand, and they would never let her forget she was marked. For a moment, her composure threatened to crack. She wanted to scream, to weep, to lash out. Instead, she took a slow breath. "You may think whatever you wish of me, Mrs. Miller," she said, her voice quiet but carrying in the stillness. "But your opinion does not change the fact that a good woman is suffering. Now, if you will excuse me." She paid the storekeeper, took the small bottle, and walked out of the store, her back straight, her dignity an invisible shield against the poisoned darts of their words. She did not see the figure at the far end of the street, half hidden in the long shadows of the blacksmith's shop. Eli sat motionless on his horse, his hat pulled low, his hands resting on the pommel of his saddle. He had followed her. He had seen the whole thing. He had watched Mrs. Miller and her flock of harpies descend, had seen the way Clara stood her ground, unbowed and unbroken. A fierce, unfamiliar surge of protectiveness had risen in him. So powerful he had tightened his grip on the reins to keep from riding forward. His presence had not gone unnoticed. Several of the men loafing on the boardwalk had seen him, and the sight of the grim, silent man on the buckskin horse had been enough to quell any thoughts of further harassment. He was a silent guardian, a dark protector she did not even know she had. He waited until she was well on her way back to the ranch before he turned his horse and followed, keeping a safe, watchful distance behind her. The incident in town, followed by Mrs. Gable's quiet passing 2 days later, settled a new layer of grim reality over the ranch. The world was hostile, and their small sanctuary was fragile. That fragility was made clear the following week. The Grahams, who had been quiet for months, began to stir. A section of Eli's fence was cut, allowing a dozen steers to wander onto Graham land, forcing Eli to spend a day retrieving them. It was a petty act designed to annoy and provoke. A few nights later, the provocation escalated. They were sitting by the fire when the sound of a horse galloping hard, followed by a drunken whoop, shattered the evening quiet. Eli was on his feet in an instant, grabbing the rifle he always kept mounted over the hearth. They heard the horse ride along their property line, Then the sharp crack of a pistol shot fired into the air. It was followed by a braying laugh that Eli recognized instantly. Tom Graham, the youngest and most reckless of the clan. Clara saw the change in Eli. The quiet, grieving man vanished, replaced by something cold and lethal. The rage he kept so tightly leashed was straining. The promise he made to his dying brother stretched to the breaking point. He moved toward the door, his knuckles white on the stock of the rifle. "Eli, do not," Clara pleaded, stepping in front of him. "That is what they want, for you to retaliate." "Get out of my way, Clara," he said, his voice a low growl she did not recognize. "No, think of Samuel. Think of what he asked you." The name was like a bucket of ice water. He stopped, his whole body trembling with the effort of reining in the violence. He stared past her, out into the dark, for a long, terrible moment. Then, with a shuddering breath, the fury receded, leaving behind the familiar, hollow ache. He did not go outside, but the peace of their small world had been shot to pieces. Later, she found him staring out the window into the blackness where the sound of the gunshot had faded. "You should tell the sheriff," she urged gently. He gave a short, bitter laugh. "The law? Sheriff Miller is paid for with Graham whiskey. The law never helped Samuel. It just drew chalk around his body." His words were stones, hard and heavy with the truth of his experience. There was no help to be had from the world outside. They were on their own. That night, the tension in the cabin was a living thing. Sleep was impossible. Clara saw him sitting by the cold hearth, rubbing his left shoulder, a gesture she now realized he made when the memories were closing in. She went to him, kneeling behind his chair, tentatively. She reached out and placed her hand on his shoulder. Through the thin fabric of his shirt, she could feel the hard, raised line of a scar. Her touch broke the last of his defenses. "They shot him from the rocks," he whispered, his voice hoarse, his gaze fixed on the dark window. "He never even saw it coming. I carried him. I tried to stop the bleeding, but there was too much." His voice broke. "He made me promise. He made me promise not to go after them. He said it had to end with him, and every day I keep that promise. It feels like I am letting him die all over again." He finally turned, and in the dim moonlight filtering through the window, she saw the tears tracking silently down his weathered face. It was the first time she had ever seen him cry. His anguish was a raw, physical presence in the room. Her own heart broke for him. She leaned forward and gently, tenderly, kissed him. It was not a kiss of passion, but of profound comfort. It was soft, hesitant, and tasted of salt and sorrow. It was a kiss that said, "I see your pain. I will not turn away from it." He did not pull back. Instead, his hand came up to cup her face, his thumb stroking her cheek, his touch as desperate and gentle as the kiss itself. It was a beginning, a fragile bridge built across an abyss of grief. When they broke apart, the air between them was charged with a new and vulnerable intimacy. The kiss had been a confession, and it invited one of its own. "I had a child," she whispered into the quiet, the words she had held inside for so long finally breaking free. "A little girl. Her name was Lily." He looked at her, his own grief momentarily set aside in the face of hers. "She had her father's blue eyes," Clara continued, a sad, faint smile touching her lips. "He was a married man, a respected man. He promised me the world. When Lily took sick with a fever, he was gone. He abandoned us. She died in my arms. And his wife, his family, the whole world. They called me a sinner and a murderer. They said I had killed my own child with my sin." She took a shuddering breath. "I came west because there was no place left for a woman who had lost everything." He pulled her closer, his arms wrapping around her in a gesture that was purely protective. He held her as she quietly wept. Two survivors clinging to each other in the dark, their shared secrets finally laid bare under the cold, watchful eyes of the moon. The confessions whispered in the dark did not magically heal their wounds, but they laid a new foundation between Eli and Clara. A fragile trust, fertilized by shared pain, began to take root in the frozen ground of their lives. They started to move not as two separate individuals sharing a space, but as a single unit, their daily rhythms weaving together into a quiet, intricate pattern. They would wake in the pre-dawn chill, his hand often reaching out to build the fire while hers was already measuring the coffee, a silent choreography of shared purpose. The work was the constant that bound them. They mended fences together, their gloved hands working in tandem, their breaths pluming in the frigid air. They repaired the roof of the chicken coop, passing the hammer back and forth, their movements economical and understood. In these shared tasks, they learned the language of each other's bodies, the slight dip of his shoulder when he was tired, the way she bit her lip when she was concentrating. They were building more than a ranch. They were rebuilding a life, plank by painful plank. One clear, cold afternoon, when the sun on the snow was so bright it hurt the eyes, Eli brought out his brother's rifle. He set up an old tin can on a fence post 50 yards away. "You need to learn," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "This land does not forgive weakness, and the Grahams do not forgive a grudge." Clara looked at the rifle with trepidation. It was a tool of violence, a thing of noise and death. It represented everything she had fled, but she saw the grim seriousness in Eli's eyes. This was not a suggestion. It was a lesson in survival. He showed her how to hold it, how to brace the stock against her shoulder, how to sight down the long barrel. His hands were gentle on her arms, adjusting her stance, his proximity a warm, solid presence against the vast, cold landscape. "Squeeze the trigger. Do not pull it," he instructed, his voice low by her ear. Her first shot was a disaster. She flinched, closing her eyes, and the rifle's kick sent a jarring shock through her shoulder, knocking her off balance. The bullet went wide, kicking up a puff of snow 10 feet from the target. The loud report of the gun echoed off the hills, a brutal sound in the winter quiet. "Again," he said patiently. She was clumsy. She was afraid of the noise, of the power she held in her hands. But with each shot, under his calm, steady guidance, something began to shift. She learned to control her breathing, to hold the sight steady, to become one with the cold metal and wood. The fear began to recede, replaced by a sharp, intense focus. An hour later, tired and bruised, she squeezed the trigger. There was a loud ping as the tin can flew off the fence post, spinning through the air. She lowered the rifle, her shoulder aching, and looked at Eli. A slow, rare smile touched his lips. It was a look of profound, quiet pride. In that moment, she was not the fallen woman from the East, and he was not the broken man of the Morgan Ranch. They were partners, and she had just learned that she, too, could be deadly. Sam's visits were a source of light in their increasingly isolated world. He would ride out on his mule, his face rosy from the cold, his pockets often filled with a stolen biscuit or an apple for Clara. He brought with him the simple, uncomplicated joy of youth, a balm to their old wounds. He would sit by the fire and tell them stories from town, his boyish voice filling the cabin with a life it had not known in years. Eli, to his own surprise, found himself opening up to the boy. He taught Sam how to track a rabbit in the snow, how to read the signs of an approaching storm in the clouds. He saw in Sam an echo of his own younger self, a time before the world had taught him that all good things could be taken away. Watching Clara with the boy, seeing her gentle patience and the easy affection she gave him, stirred something deep inside Eli. It was a painful, beautiful ache, the feeling of a heart remembering how to feel something other than grief. The mail rider, a grizzled old man who braved the winter trails once a month, brought the letter. It was addressed to Clara in a familiar, severe hand. The postmark was from Philadelphia. A cold dread washed over her as she took it. She waited until she was alone in the barn, the lowing of the cattle a comforting sound, before she broke the seal. The words were precisely as cruel as she had expected. Her father, in his cold, righteous prose, informed her that she was no longer considered a member of the Duval family. Her name had been stricken from the family Bible. She was, in his words, a source of permanent shame and a soul consigned to damnation. He enclosed a $1 bill, a final, insulting gesture of severance. She read it twice, the crisp paper trembling in her numb fingers. It should have hurt more, but as she stood there in the quiet barn, the scent of hay and animals around her, she realized the letter was just an echo from a life that was no longer hers. That world of stifling parlors and whispered judgments had already cast her out. This was just the official notice. She did not show the letter to Eli. It was a ghost from her past, and she would bury it herself. That evening, she walked to the hearth, the letter and the dollar bill in her hand. Eli watched her from his chair, his expression questioning but not intrusive. Without a word, she dropped them into the heart of the fire. She watched as the flames curled the edges of the paper, turning the hateful words to black ash, until nothing was left but a glowing ember that quickly faded. She had no family left in the world, and yet, turning from the fire and meeting the quiet, steady gaze of the man across the room, she had never felt less alone. Winter tightened its grip. A wave of sickness, a deep, racking cough, moved through the territory. Eli, run down by months of hard work and poor sleep, was taken by it. It started with a chill he could not shake, and within a day, he was consumed by a raging fever. He collapsed near the woodpile, his strength giving out completely. Clara, with a strength she did not know she possessed, managed to drag him inside and get him to his bunk. He was delirious, muttering his brother's name, his body burning with heat. The man who was her rock, her silent protector, was as helpless as a child. Fear, cold and absolute, gripped her, but it was quickly replaced by a fierce, unwavering resolve. She remembered the promise she had made on her first night in this cabin, a lifetime ago. That night, as she bathed his face with a cool cloth, his eyes fluttered open. He looked at her, his gaze clouded with fever but lucid for a moment. "Let me help you," she whispered, repeating the words she had spoken so long ago. This time, he did not meet her with silence. His hand, hot and dry, found hers and squeezed weakly. It was all the answer she needed. For 3 days and nights, she did not leave his side. She spooned water and thin broth between his cracked lips. She kept the fire roaring, fighting back the relentless cold. She sat in the chair by his bunk, her hand on his forehead, watching the fever rise and fall like a deadly tide. In the long, silent hours of the night, with the wind howling its desolate song outside, she prayed. She did not pray to Preacher Miller's vengeful God, but to whatever small, stubborn spark of hope was left inside her. On the 4th morning, the fever broke. He woke up, weak and drenched in sweat, but his eyes were clear. He looked at her pale, exhausted face, and a profound, unspoken gratitude passed between them. She had saved him. While Eli recovered, slowly regaining his strength, the Grahams made their move. They had waited for him to be at his weakest. One morning, Clara went to the creek for water and found a new fence, strung with sharp, cruel barbed wire, cutting directly across their property and blocking their access to the only reliable source of water for miles around. It was a declaration of war, a slow, deliberate strangling of their livelihood. When she told Eli, he rose from his bunk, his weakness forgotten in a surge of cold fury. He dressed and went for his rifle. "I will cut that fence and any man who tries to stop me," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Eli, no," she pleaded, stepping in front of the door, her heart pounding. "This is a trap. They want you to do something violent. They want the law on their side." "The law is not on our side," he snarled. "It never has been. Water is life. Clara, without it, the ranch dies. We die. Then we will find another way, she insisted, her hands on his chest, trying to hold him back with her sheer will. Please, do not let them turn you into the man they want you to be. Do not break your promise to Samuel. The mention of his brother was the only thing that could have stopped him. He stood there, trembling with a rage that had no outlet, his face a mask of bitter frustration. He finally leaned his head against the doorframe. Defeated. Then what do we do? He whispered. What in God's name do we do? The answer, it seemed, was nothing. The next day, Sheriff Miller rode out. He was a portly, complacent man whose loyalty was known to be for sale. Heard you had a new fence go up. Morgan, the sheriff said, not meeting Eli's eyes. Just wanted to let you know. I looked at the survey maps. Seems there is some dispute about that property line. The Grahams have filed a claim. Until the circuit judge comes through in the spring, that fence is considered private property. If you was to cut it, that would be a crime. That creek has been on Morgan land for 20 years, Eli said, his voice flat and cold. The sheriff shrugged. Like I said, there is a dispute. My advice? Do not cause any trouble. It would not go well for you. The town, well, folks are not on your side in this, not with you keeping company like you are. He glanced pointedly at Clara, who stood watching from the cabin doorway. He turned his horse and rode away, leaving them utterly and completely alone. A few days later, Sam appeared, his face a mess of bruises, a long, ugly cut on his cheek. He had a sack slung over his shoulder. My PA found out, he mumbled, his eyes downcast. He saw me packing some jerky and bread for you. He said I was consorting with sinners and that the devil had taken root in my soul. The boy tried to be brave, but his lower lip trembled. Clara gasped, pulling the boy into a gentle hug. Eli's hands clenched into fists, a deep, protective anger rising in him, an anger that was clean and pure, not like the dark rage he felt for the Grahams. This was the anger of a man seeing an injustice done to a child. You will stay here with us for a few days, Eli said, his voice firm, until your father comes to his senses. That night, Sam could not sleep. He was shaken, not just by the beating, but by his father's cruel words. Clara sat with him on the floor by the fire, rocking him gently as if he were a small child. She began to sing, her voice soft and low. It was a lullaby, a simple, sweet melody from her own childhood, a song of lost things being found, of safety after a storm. Eli sat across the room, watching them in the flickering firelight. He saw the pure, maternal love on Clara's face, the way her tenderness soothed the boy's fear and pain. He looked at this woman who had faced down a town's scorn, who had nursed him back from the brink of death, who could now cradle a beaten boy and sing the darkness away. And in that moment, a profound and painful realization pierced him to the core. All his life, he had seen love as a vulnerability, a thing to be guarded, a thing that could be lost. He had walled off his heart after Samuel's death, believing that solitude was strength. But watching Clara, he understood. Love was not a weakness. It was a fortress. It was the only shelter that could ever truly stand against the storm. He had been starving himself of the only thing that could ever save him. The weight of it all, the Grahams, the town, the beating of an innocent boy, finally broke Clara 2 nights later. She was mending one of Sam's shirts when she suddenly put her head down on the table and began to sob. It was not a loud or dramatic weeping, but a quiet, hopeless sound that was far more terrible. It was the sound of a spirit that had been strong for too long finally cracking under the pressure. I cannot take it any more. Eli, she whispered through her tears, her shoulders shaking. I cannot take being hated. I try so hard to be good, to be useful, and they look at me with such contempt. What did I do that was so wrong? I loved someone. I lost a child. Why do they hate me so much for my grief? Eli was beside her in an instant. He knelt and pulled her into his arms, her face buried against his shirt. He held her tightly, rocking her gently, his hand stroking her hair. He did not offer empty words of comfort. He just held her, absorbing her pain, letting his presence be a shield against the cruelty of the world. He breathed in the scent of her hair, felt the frantic beating of her heart against his chest, and knew, with a certainty that left no room for doubt, that he would let the whole world burn before he would let anyone hurt her again. They stayed like that for a long time, until her sobs subsided into shuddering breaths. He tilted her face up, wiping the tears from her cheeks with his thumb, in the soft lamplight. Her eyes were luminous with a raw, unguarded vulnerability that mirrored his own. The space between them was electric, charged with all the unspoken words, all the shared fears and sorrows. He leaned in and kissed her. This kiss was not like the first one, born of grief and comfort. This was a kiss of deep, desperate need, of a man and a woman who had found their only anchor in a raging sea. It was a kiss that sealed the final, unspoken truth between them. Later, in the deep quiet of the night, he led her to his bunk. Their coming together was as gentle and as powerful as the turning of a season. It was not a collision of passion, but a slow, tender exploration, a mapping of scars, both visible and hidden. It was an act of profound healing, a quiet, desperate prayer answered in the flesh. For one night, in the heart of a merciless winter, two broken souls became whole. The aftermath of their shared intimacy was not a sudden, loud transformation, but a quiet, profound settling. The cabin, once a mere shelter against the elements and their separate sorrows, began to feel like a shared harbor. A new tenderness infused their days, a lingering touch as they passed in the narrow space by the hearth, a shared glance over the rim of a coffee mug that held a universe of unspoken understanding, the simple comfort of waking in the night and knowing the other was there, a steady breath in the darkness. They were two solitary trees that had, through a long and brutal winter, finally grown close enough for their branches to intertwine, offering each other shelter from the ceaseless wind. But the town of Redemption was a place where nothing grew except suspicion. The seed of the new rumor was planted, as such things often are, by the innocent Sam, in a moment of boyish pride, mentioned to a friend in the schoolyard that Miss Clara was feeling poorly some mornings, but that Mr. Morgan was taking extra good care of her. The friend told his mother, the mother, over a bolt of calico at the general store, told the preacher's wife, and in the fertile soil of Mrs. Miller's sanctimonious imagination, the seed sprouted into a monstrous weed. Within a week, the story was all over town, spoken with righteous certainty. The fallen woman out on the Morgan ranch was with child, his child. This time, the gossip was not just a condemnation of Clara, it was an attack on Eli. He was no longer a tragic figure, a man to be pitied for his grief. He was a corrupter, a man who had taken a woman of no morals under his roof and compounded her sin with his own. Preacher Miller thundered from his pulpit about the den of iniquity that desecrated the land, and the Grahams, seeing a perfect opportunity, fanned the flames, speaking loudly in the saloon of Morgan's lack of character, hinting that a man so morally bankrupt had no right to hold on to good ranch land. Clara and Eli, isolated on the ranch, knew nothing of this until Clara had to go into town for flour and salt. Sam had been kept at home by his father for over a week, a worrying silence that added to their sense of unease. The moment she stepped onto the boardwalk, she knew something was different. The usual cold stares had been replaced by something hotter, more openly hostile. Women pulled their skirts aside as if to avoid contamination. Men looked at her with a new, leering contempt. She was inside the mercantile, her heart pounding a nervous rhythm against her ribs. When the confrontation came, it was not Mrs. Miller this time, but a hard-faced rancher's wife named Agnes Scott, a woman known for her sharp tongue and her fervent devotion to the preacher. "So, It is true. Mrs., Scott said, her voice loud enough for the entire store to hear. She stepped in front of Clara, blocking her path to the counter. You are flaunting your sin for the whole world to see. It was not enough to come here trailing your shame from the east. You had to drag a good man's memory through the mud with your filth. Clara recoiled, her face pale. I do not know what you are talking about. Do not play the innocent with me, the woman sneered, her eyes dropping to Clara's flat stomach with theatrical meaning. Carrying another bastard, are we? Or is this one just a way to trap a lonely man into keeping you? The accusation, so vile and so utterly false, stole Clara's breath. Before she could form a reply, the woman's hand shot out and slapped her hard across the face. The crack of the blow echoed in the sudden, shocked silence of the store. Clara's head snapped to the side, a bright, stinging pain blooming on her cheek, a roaring sound filling her ears. Get your hand off her. The voice was low, cold, and carried the unmistakable threat of violence. Eli stood in the doorway, his frame filling it completely. He had been on his way into town himself and had seen her wagon outside the store. He had entered just in time to see the slap. He moved with a quiet, deadly grace, his eyes pale as a winter sky, fixed on Agnes Scott. The woman took an involuntary step back, her face losing some of its righteous fury in the face of his silent rage. Eli did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He stepped to Clara's side, his presence a solid, unmovable wall. He looked around the store, his gaze sweeping over the silent, watching faces of the townspeople. This woman is with me, he said, his voice clear and steady. Her name is Clara Duval. She is the best and bravest person I have ever known. If any of you have a problem with her, you speak to me. If any of you ever lay a hand on her again, I will burn this town to the ground. He placed a hand on the small of Clara's back, a gesture of ownership and protection so absolute it left no room for doubt. The town had wanted a sinner and a corrupter. He was giving them one, on his own terms. He did not care anymore what they thought. He did not care about their judgment or their whispers. The only thing in the world that mattered was the trembling woman standing beside him. He guided her out of the store, leaving a stunned and hostile silence in his wake. Their defiance came at a terrible price. That night, as they rode the buckboard back to the ranch, the darkness on the trail was absolute. They were a mile from home when the world exploded. 3 figures rose from the rocks on the side of the road. Eli had no time to reach for the rifle under the seat. A heavy blow from a club or a gun butt caught him on the side of the head, knocking him from the wagon. Clara screamed as the Graham brothers dragged him into the road. It was Tom, his face contorted in a drunken sneer, and his 2 older, bigger brothers, Caleb and Jed. Thought you were tough in town. Morgan, Tom snarled, kicking Eli hard in the ribs. Defending your whore. A real man would have fought for his brother, not hid behind a woman's skirts. The words were designed to wound as much as the blows. Eli tried to get to his feet, but they were on him. A flurry of brutal, punishing kicks and punches. Clara, scrambling from the wagon, tried to intervene, but Jed Graham grabbed her, his powerful arms pinning her, forcing her to watch. This is what happens when you forget your place. Morgan. Caleb grunted, his fist connecting with Eli's jaw with a sickening crunch. This land is ours. It always will be. They were not trying to have a fair fight. They were trying to kill him. They beat him until he stopped moving, until he was a broken, bleeding heap in the dirt. Then, with a final, contemptuous kick, they mounted their horses and galloped off into the night, their laughter hanging in the cold, black air. Clara scrambled to Eli's side, her hands fluttering over his battered body. His face was a swollen, bloody mask, his breathing a shallow, ragged rasp. For a terrifying moment, she thought he was dead, but then a low groan escaped his lips. Panic and adrenaline gave her strength. She could not lift him. She ran, stumbling in the dark, back to the ranch. She burst into the cabin where Sam, who had run away from home again that afternoon, was waiting. "Sam, get the lantern! Help me! It is Eli, the Grahams!" Together, the woman and the boy managed to get the buckboard to him. With a strength born of desperation, they half-dragged, half-lifted his dead weight into the wagon bed and brought him home. For days, Eli hovered in a twilight world between life and death. Clara became his fierce, tireless guardian. She cleaned his wounds, the dozens of cuts and deep, purple bruises that covered his body. She set his broken arm in a crude splint. She spooned water and broth past his swollen lips, fighting the fever that threatened to consume him. Sam was her loyal assistant, fetching water, keeping the fire going, his young face a mixture of fear and grim determination. On the 5th day, Eli woke. His eyes, peering from slits in his swollen face, were clear. He looked at Clara, at her pale, exhausted features, at the dark circles under her eyes. He tried to sit up and fell back with a groan, the pain a white-hot sheet over his entire body. He was broken. The Grahams had done what the land, the grief, and the loneliness never could. They had finally broken him. He turned his face to the wall, and a sound she had never heard from him before escaped his lips, a dry, ragged sob. Then another. He wept, not loudly, but with the deep, shuddering finality of a man who had reached the absolute end of his endurance. The tears tracked through the blood and dirt on his face, a river of complete and utter despair. "I cannot do this anymore. Clara," he whispered, his voice a raw, broken thing. "They have won. I cannot fight them. I cannot live like this." Clara knelt by the bunk and took his battered hand in hers. She did not offer false hope or empty platitudes. She offered him the only truth that mattered. "You do not have to," she said, her voice soft but unshakable. "Not alone." In the days that followed, as Eli began the slow, painful process of healing, something changed in Clara. The terror and grief of the attack had burned away the last of her fear. She had watched the man she loved be beaten nearly to death, and she would not stand by and let it happen again. Eli's way, the way of violence and endurance, had led them here, to this broken place. There had to be another way. Her mind went back to the box she had found in the barn, to the beautiful, unfinished map Samuel had drawn. It was a map of a dream, but it was also a document, drawn with a surveyor's care. The creek, the one the Grahams had fenced off, was clearly marked, deep within the boundaries of the Morgan property. An idea, audacious and dangerous, began to form. She went to the shattered box, which she had kept hidden, and took out the map. She also found a small, leather-bound journal of Samuel's. In it, he had detailed his purchase of the land, referencing the official survey records filed in Santa Fe, records that predated the Grahams' arrival in the territory by 5 years. She had her evidence. Eli was still too weak to leave the cabin, but he watched her, a question in his pain-filled eyes, as she dressed in her best, though worn, dress. She tied her hair back neatly. She looked not like a rancher's woman, but like the educated lady from Philadelphia she had once been. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice still hoarse. "I am going to fight," she said simply, "but I am going to do it my way." She rode the wagon into Redemption, leaving Sam to watch over Eli. She did not go to the general store or the saloon. She went directly to the small adobe building that served as the town hall, where the 3 men who comprised the town council held their weekly meeting. Sheriff Miller was there, as were the Graham brothers, who had come to gloat and press their claim. She walked in, her head held high, clutching Samuel's map and journal. The room fell silent. Her presence was an unwelcome shock. Miss Duval, the council chairman, a prissy banker named Henderson, said with a sniff, "This is a private meeting." "I am here on behalf of Eli Morgan," she said, her voice clear and steady, betraying none of the fear that churned in her stomach. "I am here to contest the illegal fence erected by the Graham family, which is depriving Mr. Morgan of his legal water rights. Tom Graham laughed out loud. "She is a crazy woman. She has no standing here." "On the contrary," Clara said, ignoring him and unrolling Samuel's map on the council table. "This is a survey map of the Morgan property, drawn by Samuel Morgan in 1877. As you can see, it clearly shows the creek running through the center of his land." She then opened the journal. "And this is his record of the land purchase, which references the territorial survey, number 24B, filed in the Santa Fe Land Office. A survey which I am certain will confirm that the Graham fence is not on disputed land, but is, in fact, an illegal obstruction and an act of theft." The councilman stared at the documents. Sheriff Miller shifted uncomfortably in his chair. This was not the hysterical, fallen woman they had expected. This was a calm, intelligent woman armed with facts. "This is just some old drawing," Caleb Graham blustered. "It does not prove anything." "Then I invite the council to send for the official records from Santa Fe," Clara said, her gaze unwavering. "But I suspect you already know what they will say. You have been bullying and intimidating ranchers in this valley for years, but you made a mistake when you beat a man half to death and thought his partner was just a helpless woman you could ignore. I am not helpless, and I will not be ignored." She risked everything in that moment, her safety, her dignity. She stood alone, a single woman against a room full of hostile, powerful men, but her courage, born of love and desperation, was a force they had not anticipated. It shamed them. Sheriff Miller, seeing the undeniable evidence, and perhaps feeling a flicker of the lawman he was supposed to be, finally spoke. "She is right," he said quietly. "I have seen the old surveys. That fence is on Morgan land." The Grahams erupted in angry protests, but it was too late. Clara had won. The council, faced with irrefutable evidence and a sudden crisis of conscience from the sheriff, had no choice. They voted to order the fence removed. Clara walked out of the town hall and into the afternoon sun, her body trembling with the aftermath of the confrontation. She had not only won back their water, she had won back their dignity. When she arrived back at the ranch, Eli was sitting in the chair by the door, waiting for her. He was pale and weak, but he had managed to get himself dressed. He watched her walk across the yard, her steps tired but triumphant. He saw the strength that held her straight, the fire that burned in her eyes. He saw the woman who had nursed him, protected him, and fought for him with a bravery he had never witnessed in any man. She stood in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the golden light of the setting sun, and as he looked at her, the last wall around his heart crumbled to dust. The realization came to him, not as a thought, but as a profound and overwhelming truth that filled every part of his broken body. He loved her. It was as simple and as absolute as the rising of the sun. He was a man who had thought he had lost everything, only to find that everything he had ever needed had just walked through his door. The spring thaw came late that year, but when it arrived, it felt like a pardon. The iron grip of winter released the land, and the creek, freed from its icy prison, ran high and fast, its cheerful gurgle a song of resurrection. The Graham fence was gone, dismantled by 2 hired men under the watchful eye of Sheriff Miller, a quiet act of civic restitution that echoed through the valley. With the return of the water came the return of life, not just to the land, but to the people on it. Eli's body healed slowly, the deep bruises fading from purple to a sickly yellow and then gone, leaving only the memory of the blows. But his spirit, which had been broken in a way bones never could be, began to mend at a different pace, guided by the quiet, steady presence of Clara. They made a conscious decision, not in a grand declaration, but in a series of small, deliberate actions. They were no longer just surviving. They were building. They would build something new. They started with the burned-out section of the barn. Eli, his arm still in a sling but his strength returning, directed the work while Clara, surprisingly adept with a hammer, helped him nail new timbers into place. The clean, sharp scent of freshly cut pine mingled with the smell of damp earth, the aroma of a new beginning. They were rebuilding the structure that had been destroyed by hate, and in doing so, they were rebuilding themselves. The town of Redemption watched from a distance, its opinion as divided as a forked road. The preacher's flock, led by the perpetually scandalized Mrs. Miller, continued to see them as a blight, a testament to the moral decay they so eagerly sought out. But others, the ranchers who had lived under the Graham's thumb, the quiet folk who valued grit over gossip, began to see them differently. They had seen Clara's courage at the town council meeting. They had seen Eli's willingness to stand for her, no matter the cost. Respect, a commodity more valuable than gold in that hard country, began to flow their way in a slow, cautious trickle. Sheriff Miller rode out one afternoon, not with a warning, but with a sack of potatoes and a piece of news. He sat uncomfortably on the porch step, accepting a cup of Clara's coffee, his gaze drifting toward the newly framed section of the barn. "Heard Tom Graham got himself into a drunken brawl down in Socorro," the sheriff said, studying his cup. "Stabbed a man over a card game. They have locked him up. I do not expect he will be seeing the light of day for a good long while." Eli just nodded, his face giving nothing away. "The other two," the sheriff continued. "Jed and Caleb, they sold off what was left of their herd. Word is they are heading for California. I do not think you will be troubled by them again." It was an apology, as close as a man like the sheriff would ever come. It was an acknowledgement that he had let things go too far, and that Clara and Eli had done his job for him. When he left, there was a new lightness in the air, the lifting of a long, dark siege. Sam's final arrival at the ranch was a sad, quiet affair. Preacher Miller, his pride stung by his son's defiance and the town's shifting allegiances, rode out one morning. He did not get off his horse. He sat stiffly in the saddle, his face a mask of cold piety. "I am sending him to my sister in St. Louis," the preacher announced, not looking at Sam, who stood by the cabin door. "He will learn obedience and piety in a Christian home, away from this influence." Clara stepped forward, her hands clenched at her sides. "You cannot just send him away. He is your son." "He has made his choice," the preacher said, his voice like the crack of a whip. "He has chosen a life of sin. He is no longer welcome in my house." Eli walked slowly from the barn, his limp barely noticeable now. He stood beside Clara, his presence a silent challenge. "Then he is welcome in ours," Eli said, his voice low and even. "He will have a home here, for as long as he wants one." The preacher stared at them, his face a battleground of fury and defeat. He had lost his son, not to sin, but to a kindness he could not comprehend. Without another word, he turned his horse and rode away, a rigid figure of judgment who had, in the end, judged himself out of his own son's life. That evening, the three of them sat at the supper table. Sam was quiet, his face pale. He was an orphan now, in all the ways that mattered. Clara reached across the table and put her hand over his. "This is your home now, Sam," she said softly. "We are your family." The boy's face crumpled, and he began to cry. The silent, heartbroken tears of a child who has been rejected by the one person who should have loved him unconditionally. Clara went to him, holding him, while Eli watched, his heart aching with a fierce, protective love for this boy and this woman who had, together, brought him back to life. A few days later, Eli took a piece of paper and a pencil and walked out to the big cottonwood tree that stood by the creek, its new spring leaves a vibrant, hopeful green. It was the tree where he and Samuel had rested in the shade after a long day's work, where they had planned their future. He sat with his back against its sturdy trunk and began to write. He wrote to his brother. He told him everything. He wrote about the long, empty year of rage and grief, of the silence that had filled the cabin, of the promise that had felt like a cage. He wrote about Clara, how she had appeared like a half-starved bird and had shown him a strength he had never known. He wrote about the Grahams, about the beating, about how Clara had fought back not with a gun, but with courage and the truth. He wrote about Sam, and how the sound of a boy's laughter had begun to thaw his frozen heart. "I am letting go of the hate, Samuel," he wrote, the pencil pressing hard into the paper. "I think that is what you wanted. It is not forgetting. I will never forget you. But it is living. I am trying to live. I have a good woman by my side. I have a son who needs me, and I have hope. I wanted you to know." He folded the letter carefully, and with his hands, he dug a small hole in the soft earth at the base of the tree. He placed the letter inside, a final message to a ghost, and covered it with dirt. He was burying the past, not to erase it, but to make it part of the foundation of his new life. While Eli was burying his ghosts, Clara was planting flowers. On a trip to town, she had bought a small packet of poppy seeds. The storekeeper's wife, a woman who had once stared at her with contempt, had given her a small, shy smile and added a packet of marigold seeds for free. Back at the ranch, Clara cleared a small patch of ground near the cabin door, the same hard, dusty soil where she had collapsed in exhaustion all those months ago. She worked the soil with her hands, breaking up the clumps, her fingers sinking into the cool, dark earth. Eli watched her from the porch. He watched her sprinkle the tiny seeds into the furrows, her movements as careful and reverent as if she were performing a sacred rite. It was a small, simple act, but it felt monumental. No one had ever planted flowers on this ranch. The Morgan men had been concerned with cattle and fences, with survival. They had never had time for beauty. Clara was planting a flag of hope in the stubborn, unyielding land, a declaration that they would have more than survival. They would have a life, and it would be beautiful. The seasons turned. Summer came, hot and dry, and Clara's flowers bloomed in a riot of defiant color, brilliant oranges and fiery reds against the muted browns of the landscape. The ranch began to prosper. With the Grahams gone, Eli was able to expand his grazing routes, and his herd grew fat and healthy. Clara's own purpose began to bloom as well. She saw the children from the neighboring ranches, boys and girls growing up as wild as the land, with no access to education. She cleaned out the newly repaired section of the barn, the part that had once been a monument to hate, and turned it into a schoolhouse. She built a few rough desks and a blackboard. She put out the word that she would be teaching reading, writing, and arithmetic to any child who wished to learn. At first, only 2 children came, but word of her gentle patience and her gift for teaching spread. Soon, there were 8 students, their bright, eager faces filling the small space. The sound of children reciting their letters now filled the barn, a joyful noise that washed away the last of the old ghosts. One cool autumn afternoon, Eli and Clara rode into redemption. It was the first time they had gone together since the confrontation in the store, but this time was different. Sam rode between them on his mule, chattering happily. As they reached the main street, Eli reached over and took Clara's hand. She laced her fingers through his without hesitation. They rode down the center of the street, hand in hand, their heads held high. They were not ashamed. They were not hiding. They were a family. They received nods of greeting, looks of grudging respect. They were no longer the town scandal. They were the Morgans. A new preacher had come to town, a young, earnest man from the East who had replaced the bitter Reverend Miller. He saw them one day and, meaning well, offered to marry them properly in the eyes of God. Eli and Clara looked at each other, a silent communication passing between them. They politely declined. Their union had been forged in a fire the church could not comprehend. It did not need the sanction of a man in a black coat. Instead, they held their own ceremony. They stood beneath the great cottonwood tree, with only Sam as their witness. The autumn sun cast a golden light through the yellowing leaves. They did not exchange rings. They exchanged vows that were simple, honest, and spoken from the heart. I was lost, Eli said, his voice thick with emotion as he looked into her eyes. And you found me. You are my home, Clara. You are my peace. I was broken, she said, her own eyes shining with tears. And you gave me a place to heal. You gave me a life when I thought mine was over. I will stand by you. I will fight for you. Always. They sealed their promises with a kiss. A long, deep kiss that was full of the hardships they had endured and the quiet joy they had finally found. That night, a cold wind howled outside, a familiar, lonely sound from a time that felt a lifetime ago. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm, dancing glow on the walls of the cabin. Sam was asleep in the small room that had been built for him off the main one. Clara was tending the fire, her face soft and serene in the flickering light. The cabin was filled with the scent of baking bread and the quiet peace of a day's hard work well done. Eli watched her from his chair. He saw the strength in the line of her back, the kindness in the gentle movements of her hands. He thought of the long, empty years he had spent in this room, a prisoner of his own grief, believing that solitude was his permanent fate. He rose and walked over to her, his footsteps silent on the wooden floor. He reached out and touched her hand. She turned to him, a soft, questioning look in her eyes. He looked at her, his heart so full he could barely speak. I thought I would always be alone, he said softly, the words a final confession of the man he used to be. She smiled, a slow, beautiful smile that held all the love in the world. She brought his hand to her lips and kissed his rough knuckles. Let me help you, she whispered back. He nodded, a simple, profound movement of acceptance. The fight was over. The rage was gone. He was home, and he was, at long last, finally at peace. Thank you for listening to our story around the campfire. Let us know in the comments where you are listening from so we can all connect. And be sure to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.